All right. Hi, everybody. This is our first episode in the Why Elm is Not Dead series. Now, I don't know if we're going to create a lot of episodes in the series, but one thing we found when working with people and specifically with Elm and trying to sell Elm to CTOs, technical founders, developers, we get these common questions, we have common misconceptions, we have people giving concerns, and we really try to look at things from first principles and not arguing by analogy. So saying a tech stack is good because it's trending isn't necessarily scientific. It might be, but it's not necessary. So we are looking at things a bit different, specifically using the Elm and Lambda stack, and which gives us an edge and our clients an edge. And there are definitely a lot of misconceptions and questions out there. So we thought to record this first video in the series and this first episode. So that's kind of introduction. I have Skulk here today, our CTO. I'm going to ask him a few hard questions, and then we'll see how well Skulk performs. So the first question is just on the state of Elm. So one thing we get a lot is Elm has no major release. There is issues on the GitHub. People are saying the project's dead when they look at it. Skulk, if I come to you and I say Elm is dead because there's no major release, there are a lot of issues, what would kind of be your response to this?
Well, the thing is basically like Elm hasn't had a major release in a while is a completely different statement from Elm is dead, right? So essentially the thing is that if we look at what Elm is really, really good at, Elm is really, really good at making code that runs on the front end. And the question is basically like, is there anything else that is newer that is very, very much better at making code run on the front end? And to that, the answer is like, unfortunately not. So the thing is essentially like we get a lot of value out of Elm as it is now. And one of the principles from the Elm community is that Elm as it is now is probably Elm as it will be for quite a while. So that's definitely not to say that there will never ever be any other release for Elm. And it's also definitely not to say that Elm in its current state is not usable. One of the other things to just keep in mind as well is that where certain like competing frameworks have a new release or a new major release, monthly or maybe even sometimes more frequently than that, oftentimes those release cycles are a artifact of fundamental instability. Whereas in Elm's case, basically, it's the fact that there are not frequent releases are more indicative actually of the fact that the program as it exists now actually does address the vast majority of needs.
Okay, cool. That's very interesting. And if I can just ask you the question, why does JavaScript have to frequently, or framework, I say JavaScript, but we obviously get JavaScript frameworks, but take a framework like React or Gatsby, one of those. Why do they have to have these frequent releases all the time? And why does Elm not need that? So why can I build stuff with Elm and I almost never need a new release?
Okay, so part of the thing is basically addressing new features. So there are two ways to think of new features. Like the one would be there is a legitimately new feature, right? The other thing would basically be addressing deficits, as in other words, like either there is a known bug or B, something is really not working optimally, right? So the thing about Elm is because of the strict type system, a lot of the stuff that is created in Elm typically only needs to get written once, and then it's very, very stable. And releases on top of that are typically like only really new feature releases. The second thing is basically like Elm is very easy to refactor. So it's very easy to actually get to kind of like a stable state. Fundamentally, due to the fact that JavaScript is very accommodating, it's very, very hard to actually reach a stable state, since lots of the accommodating features of the language itself ends up making any system you try and build within it fairly unstable.
Okay, so you need frequent releases basically to fix those problems. I think one example I love to use is back in the day. Well, I say back in the day, but these days with technology, yesterday's back in the day. But when I was still playing around with Linux firewalls and stuff, I wanted to do a layer 7 firewall with IP tables, which requires you to modify the kernel and include additional modules and stuff. So you actually have to like unpack the ISO file and put some stuff in there, and then mount that again and try, and you run into a whole host of problems. But something that was so interesting to me
sounds simple enough.
something that was so interesting to me back then was when I saw the IP version for kernel code at that stage. I believe it was last changed in 1996. And that made me realize it works. We don't have to change it. So it's not like we need these constant things. And that's how I like to think about Elm is out of the box, what we have there works, and we can fundamentally do everything pretty much with it. I mean, there are a few missing things here and there, but it doesn't need new releases and stuff. Next question is just to talk a bit about the finding developers, because that's something we hear a lot as well. Is people say, all right, okay, you make a good argument about why Elm is not dead, and that sounds interesting, but I can't find any developers online, and what do I do if you guys build for me? Who's going to maintain the code if the relationship doesn't work out, or anything goes wrong? What do I do? And what do you think about it's hard to find developers for Elm?
Okay, so what I'd say basically is compared to what, right? It's entirely possible that you can build a JavaScript or TypeScript application in whatever framework du jour, and then have an equal amount of trouble actually finding people willing to maintain that specific application and that specific set of architectural and framework choices, right? That's a very frequent problem. Right. The same is true for PHP or basically any other framework that you select. Like, it's oftentimes possible to find people willing to work in a framework, but who are not necessarily willing to maintain your piece of code. Right. So just due to the decision that the previous developers made on it. So the thing is essentially about Elm is that Elm does two things. It's a very, very simple language, and it is a prescriptive architecture. So the Elm architecture, or T as they call it, basically decides a lot of things for developers beforehand. And what that causes is it basically means that every Elm app is laid out in pretty much the same way. So if you go onto the Elm Slack at the moment and you go into the jobs channel and you post there, listen, I need maintenance on this, and you basically post your terms there, you will pretty much immediately have about 4 or 5 takers. So there definitely is a marketplace for you to actually find people. In terms of longer term engagement, what we found basically is that if you take intermediate developers or anybody who's just basically curious and you handhold them through one feature, so in other words, like you help them through the process of actually building one feature in Elm. The thing is, because Elm is laid out in a standard fashion, it is thereafter very, very easy for them to build the next feature and a next feature and a next feature, basically. So the actual cost of understanding Elm is much lower than people really realize. But it is a little bit of a stretch of assumptions for people to accept that, and to get to a point where they're comfortable with going in that direction.
Yeah, I think in short, the amount of stuff you have to learn to boot up .NET, C# kind of stack versus what you need to learn to boot up Elm. Sure, maybe Elm itself is a different way of thinking. I mean, if you have no loops, you can't redefine variables. Say that to most guys, they'll give you a stare and then this facial expression and be like, but how, and then they're not sure what they're asking, So it is a different mindset, but I think just the amount of changes as opposed to the amount of stuff you have to learn for a different stack, it really isn't that hard to train people as most guys say. So, all right. So I think kind of to tie in finding developers, let's chat a bit about the community. So if I go onto the Elm Slack, I think, don't quote me, but it's either 24 or 34,000 members. It slipped my mind, but I think it's 34,000 when I last joined on this new Mac. If you compare this to JavaScript communities, that's much smaller. So we got this question again today in a call. We don't have the amount of packages, we don't have the amount of community members. Do you think it's concerning that the Elm community is so small at the moment compared to other communities?
Well, the question there is, again, compared to what? Like, and what exactly is the comparison? The thing is essentially that the idea is that because you have a lot of JavaScript or a lot of TypeScript developers, that you can very easily, like, basically, that you can very easily just swap people in and out. Like we already discussed, that's not necessarily the case. The other thing as well is that because the environment is the environment of TypeScript, JavaScript versus the environment of Elm, Elm is a far more orderly environment. It's far easier for you to get things done. So the question is sort of like, would you rather live in like a clean, safe city, or do you want to live in a slum where you have a lot of company? You know, the one's population might be lower than the other, but there are very, very clear benefits to actually like living in an orderly environment, if that answers your question.
Yeah, I think that is definitely one way to look at it is the size of a community often also creates a perception that there are a lot of high quality people in there that can help you. And I don't think that's always the case with a lot of the tools is yes, there are a lot of members or maybe a lot of people that have heard about JavaScript and they join the Slack and it's all exciting. They're really just in there because it's a buzzword, but they're not there to really provide value. So I think if you compare that to Elm, then you'll see that the amount of high quality people in those communities versus Elm, the difference is no longer so big. So I think that's also a very interesting way to look at it. Another thing we hear a lot is people saying, okay, so I'll build my code base in JavaScript and there are just hundreds of agencies, thousands of agencies, millions of developers out there that can help me. And we've said, you know, there are fewer people in the Elm community, but just explain to me this is kind of a misconception about JavaScript, that I can just hand over this code base to somebody else and it's just, you know, it's just they continue in where I left off, as opposed to handing over an Elm code base. What's your kind of take on that?
Yeah, so basically in terms of handing over code bases, again, the thing about Elm is that in Elm, you have a very limited set of tools with how you accomplish anything, right? You also have a prescribed architecture for how your applications are actually laid out. The result of that is that anybody who has built an Elm app or who has worked on an Elm app can pretty much understand most Elm apps, right? Whereas with JavaScript, because you have it's very permissive and there are very, very many ways to do a thing. Like, think about the amount of ways that you can iterate over a list in JavaScript. There are several. I think the last time I counted, there were 4 or 5 or 6, you know, different ways of just basically like taking a list and iterating over the list and doing different things with it. In addition to that language flexibility, there is no prescribed architecture. So the thing is, every application becomes sort of like becomes a potluck of different approaches on how to solve the problem. Right. So people basically enter the project, they have different ideas about how stuff should happen, and then they make all of these ad hoc decisions. And anybody who tries to maintain it has to be handheld for a very, very long period of time before you can reliably say, okay, this guy knows what's going on in the code base. We can actually like let him loose on his own reconnaissance.
Yeah. That is definitely the ability to I think I saw the other day, you just model view message, and you know what the code does. And any Elm developer out there that knows Elm can look at that and understand what it's doing. But, you know, take the same thing to a JavaScript framework and you have side effects and you have, you know, all these things happening, and you can't, you know, the cool thing in Elm is just going to the definition, or to go to the specific model or where it's being used or all the occurrences, and it kind of, you know, pipes you through this flow and shows you. You can't do that in other frameworks. So I think handover with Elm is far less of a problem than we're used to with other code bases. To talk a bit about the public perception of Elm. So if I Google stuff, I just see a lot of bad stuff on Elm, you know. Is it a marketing problem? I mean, Elm also has its problems. I think it's completely different from what we're used to in other stacks. But is it a marketing problem? What are the perceptions that the Elm community also creates?
Well, okay. I do want to say that one of the core values of the Elm community is they strive to have the most welcoming community. And one of the things about the most welcoming community is, unlike other languages, I won't name any, if somebody disagrees with them, they don't declare holy war on them and basically like start flaming them in the comments and going all crazy. The thing is, they typically try and be, soft-spoken and accommodating to people who say stuff. And oftentimes what ends up happening is that people will say things about Elm, and either A, it will be an unfair characterization, or B, it'll be within a very niche context that only somebody who has developed Elm for quite a while would really understand. And then typically the community would not actually respond in terms of going like, listen, these are the reasons why this is a flawed assumption, right? So, and the other thing as well is that there are a lot of people who might have a cursory look on Elm and then give a cursory comment on it. And like we said, unfortunately, the size of the community does not allow for an absolutely exhaustive rebuttal of every single bad comment out there. So the unfortunate result is that a lot of the stuff that ends up online are sort of like fairly negative, or probably the wrong characterization, but very skeptical takes on Elm. Typically, like that's the stuff that that seems to filter to the top, basically. Yeah.
So Skulk, you've convinced me about Elm. You've addressed my developer concerns. You've addressed, Elm being dead. You've addressed a lot of the stuff by this point, and hopefully we achieve that for some others as well. The point, or something that still remains fact, is you can't get away from JavaScript. JavaScript runs on, most devices on the planet, and there's so many libraries and stuff out there. Let's say I perhaps want to use Google Maps or Plotly or, some JavaScript library in my Elm project. How do I do that? And how well does Elm play with other technologies?
So the thing is, if you look at any technology, well, the way that I evaluate any technology is sort of like on one of the things I look for as a hygiene feature. In other words, something that has to be in there is escape hatches. Like when you can't do something within this current framework, how do you actually escape the framework and go do it somewhere else and then get your results back? So Elm basically has a system called ports. And via ports, you can essentially communicate with any JavaScript framework. And what's great about ports is it allows you a very safe way to actually communicate to the JavaScript world. Any errors that happen in the JavaScript world can be dealt with in the JavaScript world, and you don't have to worry about it necessarily affecting negatively the state of your Elm application. So that's one way that you could use the outside world. Another thing that you could also do is you can wrap pieces of JavaScript in web components. So in other words, you can create an HTML web component, and then you can access that HTML web component as though it were an HTML web, well, essentially an HTML element inside of your VDOM already. So those are two ways of doing that. And via those two systems, you can essentially access and leverage anything that is available inside of JavaScript.
I've also heard that Elm apparently makes JavaScript better. So where a JavaScript library would normally load everything into my code base and make it very heavy, Elm seems to just know what it's going to use in that library and just kind of render that stuff. Is that true for Elm or just for Lambda? What's your experience and take on that?
So part of the way that Elm compiles a project is it tries to do minimal importing of functions. So in other words, inside of Elm, not inside of JavaScript, inside of Elm, what ends up happening if you use one function, one or two functions or a type or something from a different library, the Elm compiler is smart enough to only include the stuff that was actually used inside of the final work product. Now, in terms of JavaScript, because the JavaScript lives on the outside of the Elm system, it can't necessarily only trim the stuff that is used, but if you use your importing system in JavaScript correctly, then you can still control what basically gets pulled in through that aspect of things.
Okay. So I think the whole Linux, Windows, Mac community will probably disagree with me on this one, but it's pretty much like running, Windows on Mac. It's you get the benefits of Windows, but Mac just makes it better. So so I think that's kind of a comparison there for us. So we're almost getting to the end of this. I want to kind of handle a non-first principles question, arguing by analogy, and kind of get your take on this. So JavaScript has been around for much longer than Elm, and many companies have used it, many massive, companies and millions of developers. Therefore, JavaScript must be better. What would you say about that argument?
It's possible to argue. I mean, like, when have large mass of people ever been wrong? More seriously, basically. Yeah, so the thing is, I mean, the fact that something is widely distributed does not necessarily make it the best tool for the job, right? The thing is, there's a saying that says distribution beats innovation. And the one thing is that when JavaScript was invented, it was basically built in 10 days, and it was distributed on Netscape Navigator. So essentially, one of the most viral applications in history, the web browser, and the primary web browser included JavaScript. And that's kind of like what JavaScript's dissemination mechanism was. That's incredibly difficult to compete with that. Now, this guy called Brendan Eich, he's also the guy behind the Brave browser. He was the engineer at Netscape who actually included this. And I always make the joke that if he didn't include it, we should be thankful that he used JavaScript and not something like OCaml at the time and included that, because if he did that, then the singularity and the AI taking over would have undoubtedly happened already. But luckily, in the meantime, he's put such a brake on productivity, that humanity has had these extra 30 years. More seriously, though, the thing is just the fact that a lot of people use it is not necessarily it's not necessarily an indication of the quality of that thing necessarily. Another misconception also is that JavaScript is much older and battle tested. To some degree, that is true. I mean, modern JavaScript is very little like the original version of JavaScript. But the type system, it's called the Hindley-Milner type system that Elm, Haskell, OCaml, F#, those languages are based on. That type system has been in production in the original ML language for something like 50 years at this stage. So that thing is incredibly highly battle tested at this point. Right now, the thing is just it is a parallel branch of programming languages. So unfortunately, it has never really gained dominance. But yeah, that's not to say that it hasn't been battle tested and that people haven't built a lot of production code in it.
So the next question I kind of want to, answer from my perspective, and that's just also another, by analogy, is that no big companies are using Elm and a lot of big companies are using JavaScript. And upon doing some research, and I mean, this stuff is all open on the internet, but, we found Brilliant, Vendor, No Red Ink, Thoughtbot, quite a few large companies. And there's actually a list of companies using Elm. But Brilliant, for instance, on their graphing software, and they made a detailed video on this that's also available on YouTube, where they actually explain how Elm is being used for that kind of stuff and why they chose this. So big entities are making this massive investment, actively hiring for Elm, despite all these concerns. And some of these entities have really reputable CTOs, vendor Aaron White, for instance, who really also tries to look at things from first principles. If you listen to some of the podcasts, one of the things he said the other day was hiring Elm developers gives you access to potentially some of the best developers in the world, because it's such a cutting edge technology, they're using it. So just hiring out of that pool automatically gives you access to those people. And to kind of also look at that and say, these companies have made these investments and decisions and they've done thorough digging, and they wouldn't have done that if Elm was completely dead. So I think that's also just a good way of doing it. So Skulk, this has been very insightful and fun to have this chat with you. The last question for today is around the packages and their, maintenance and when they've last been updated. Let's look at something like Elm Review. Why isn't it necessarily a problem that it hasn't recently been updated and, seems outdated? Why is that not a problem?
Well, it would depend on the purpose of the package, basically. Like, if the thing is, if the environment in which it's deployed is like obviously in flux, then if there's no new update, that might be a concerning factor. But if it's like if it's a known domain with a known set of solutions, then the fact that there has not been a recent update is probably more of an indication that it is stable and it is actually done.
Yeah, I think it's also in the nature of pure functional. If it works fundamentally and you import it, it works. It doesn't break the code base, and therefore, if it works, then there's no real need to update it. We've actually found that sometimes you can go quite a long time by not updating packages, and there might have been new releases and new features, but they keep on working even though they're not aware of those things. So yeah.
Well, it's the NPM saying, if it ain't broke, it will break.
So true. Well, Skulk, it's been a lot of fun. Thanks for recording this together with me. I hope we've answered some of the misconceptions and that this has been helpful. And yeah, I've enjoyed chatting with you.
Cool. Thanks, Chris. Appreciate it.